I decided that after kind of the sensationalization of Standing Rock, the Pinokies, and other fights, it was right after the summer of George Floyd, I was searching for something as a kid who had freshly come out of foster care. I was kind of molded by the hands of manipulative and powerful women who kind of raised me up to be this image of what they wanted the next generation to do and become. And, fighting Line 3 was something that I believed in to the core of my being. It was something that was kind of instilled in me. And I decided that if anyone was going to take a stand here in Fond du Lac, it had to be me. I was really worried about if it wasn't me, who it would be. And it kind of felt to me that I had an opportunity to decide who could and could not come into my area to fight Line 3. And, going into it feet first, I had no idea what could happen or what to be prepared for. It was a mix of so much emotion and adrenaline, and there were a lot of beautiful, meaningful connections that I made during that time. And there are also memories that I wish I could forget. I have post-traumatic stress from the fight against Line 3. Nobody really told us what we were running towards, and many of us said that we didn't want another Standing Rock. Nobody wanted that. But here we were in positions where people not from our area would agitate and create situations that were so similar that, to this day, I still have nightmares about, hearing the sounds of my friends choking on pepper spray, pepper balls. I remember what it was like to look up and be 10 yards away from a law enforcement officer with, a rifle that was filled with less than lethals. I have trauma from the fight because I put myself in those positions at the urgings of others. And the work that I'm doing now is kind of helping me heal that. I hear the sounds of heavy machinery all of the time. And even before I started working construction, I have so many friends that I met on this journey who to this day are trying to navigate their lives with felony charges because we were told that everyone is a treaty person and that this was needed and necessary of us. And now there are children out there, not even 20 years of age yet, who are felons.
And their lives are changed by that.
Essentially, their lives are over. Many of them can't rent. They can't go to college. I met a young woman who fought Line 3 because she was an environmentalist. It meant a lot to her. She had a scholarship for college to do environmental science, and she was very excited about it. And she locked herself to a gate in a protest, and she received charges, and that scholarship was pulled. There was no one there at the end of the day to help her get into college or get a job. And, we helped her pay for a cosmetology degree, and she's cutting hair, but that's nothing in the face of what she wanted for her life. I was never a protester. I'm not going to sit here and be like, I was a protector. That was never my goal. We call ourselves protector, but we weren't really protecting anything other than the agenda of people who already had millions in their bank accounts. We were pushed forward by hands that have never tended a garden or held a newborn. And they kept chanting a better world, as we're being pushed in front of heavy machinery, excavators, law enforcement with less than lethals, and we were ready to die for it. And if anyone stood in our way, I wasn't a protector. If anyone stood in my way, they just took my death from me. And I didn't care about who I may harm in the process of meeting my goal. When you get leaders of movements, there's like a hierarchy almost, like the leader is almost considered too precious to the movement to risk arrest. And you've seen that in different areas of the Line 3 fight, but the way I navigated with the people around me at Camp Migizi was there was an emotional, almost maternal aspect to it. I was the youngest, queerest camp, but I was one of the oldest people in my camp. So many of the people who came out here because they were emotionally drawn to support me were young, very young people. And, if you're going to ask someone to do something, it can never be something you're not willing to do yourself. And so I went in every day prepared to be arrested. And that was a sense of solidarity, a sense of community, belonging, family, brotherhood almost. Like the bonds that we had, I would speak to them about all of the time. Like the connections we are making here runs deeper than pipelines. And it's deeper than trauma bonds. Like the way I navigated space was I was charismatic, I was energetic, I was very emotional. I brought all emotion to the front line. And that spoke to people. People didn't come to Camp Migizi to fight Line 3 because I was a strong woman who ascended these social ladder climbing on the backs of other women. That wasn't me. People came to Camp Migizi to fight beside me because I was vulnerable. I brought emotion into it. It was more real to be in that space with me as something that you can't really explain unless you were there. When you're a woman in the movement, that ribbon skirt you wear is a battle flag that people are willing to follow. And that was how I navigated with my little family, and I think that is something that weighs really heavy on my heart, is knowing that I played a part, essentially, in raising children who believed and trusted in me to move forward into the world, fighting pipelines and police and injustices by utilizing nonviolent direct action. And this was coming off of the summer of George Floyd. There was already so much unrest in the world. This was coming off of racial disparities, climate change, all of these different things that were really fueling these young people who were willing to throw away their entire lives, their life, liberty, and safety to stand that line next to me. And for me, I knew where these kids were coming from. We've seen with the protests how bad it could get in Minneapolis with the precinct burning. I didn't want any of that here, and I knew a lot of that animosity and anger was within them. And so for me, I carry so much anger. If I carry it all, if I take it all, they feel safer standing behind me when I'm essentially absorbing all of this and I'm the one speaking and unleashing it onto the police and the pipeliners in front of me. And it was like I had to so that they wouldn't. It was very important to me that people not from my community didn't have an opportunity to abuse workers who are from here. Tribal police officers. I've grown up with those men. I've sat in ceremony with them. They fed my children. We've shared meals together. That's my family. My family was working the line. My family was out there, and essentially I had to be the one to interact with everyone because I didn't want them to be abused by people who are not from here, do not know you. And it was almost like I wanted to protect my community, but I also had to fight against it. And it was a very difficult space for me to be in. There were trainings that were offered by different environmental groups such as Sierra Club, Honor the Earth, MN350. Know your rights training was one of them, how to interact with an officer if they approach you after a protest, I believe everyone should know your rights, but at the same time, you're like specifically teaching people these skill sets so that they can be more effective in creating civil unrest. And that was the goal. We absolutely wanted to create situations where we are disrupting business as usual. We are creating situations where these people can't get into work safely. And we're being put in situations where a lot of us weren't aware of what we were doing or what we were putting at risk. So many of us, we join these protests because it matters. There's an emotional aspect that's pulling you forward, like to the core of your being, you believe that you need to stop that excavator from moving. And especially with people who are vulnerable and easily manipulated, they tend to join these situations and protests searching for a sense of community. And that is essentially what I did. I built an entire community out in the woods because I felt like I didn't have a strong sense of community within my own home. And it was almost like a bunch of ragtag Peter Pan lost boys. And we're giving our all to fight this pipeline, not realizing that what we're really doing is fueling the capitalistic agenda of people looking to purchase islands and museums. We absolutely weaponized culture because, you go in to a protest and you're carrying something sacred or something that could be deemed sacred. Like, I've seen people go in with entire sweat lodges that they're carrying and hoping that the police will damage it. Because if you can get into the hearts and emotions of Indigenous people, you've called on a whole army. Indigenous people are connected so very deeply by language, by culture, by land. How dare they do this to our sweat lodge? And we knew that. People know that going in, and identity politics are really utilized really heavy in these spaces, like you do something wrong and someone tries to hold you accountable to it. How dare you? Know who you're talking to? I'm an Indigenous woman. That alone will have someone shrinking into their coattails. Like, that's scary. And a lot of people don't realize how abusive that can be, especially if you're taught to do it. Like, you're told that you're accountable only to the next 7 generations. That was something that we said. And if we're saying that, how dare you try to hold me accountable for being abusive or wrong or aggressive in any given situation, because I'm fighting for the future of your children. So why are you questioning me? The abuse of our culture, the abuse of identity politics, the abuse of being able to speak in your language are things that are heavily, heavily utilized. And as young people who are searching for some form of connection, to come into contact with something like that, it's terrifying, and it's because you're starving for that. Your soul is hungry for a spiritual connection, and it's being manipulated, and you don't know any better. A lot of the people who join these protests are children, like I was the leader of the youngest and queerest camp fighting Line 3. I reached an entire generation and group that couldn't really be reached before. And that was because of who I was as a person. People didn't show up to Camp Migizi to fight Line 3 the way they would other spaces. people showed up to Line 3 to fight with Camp Migizi because I brought emotion into it. I made it real for them. And that was something that we were really good at as leaders of these movements, is almost an emotional manipulation, to really get in there. And it's something you're going to be thinking about later when you go home, is the amount of abuse to the culture itself that was happening made people who are culturally sensitive feel sick. There were people who had to leave events, leave protests. There were people who felt the need to go be doctored. I've watched people, go into situations with sacred objects that you're not even supposed to be carrying out in the open, and are putting themselves in a position where, well, if I get arrested and this is damaged or taken, it's really going to rile people up. And that was the goal for a lot of people. It was something that we were almost taught to do. I think a huge pivotal moment for me was realizing the hypocrisy of our movements. There was so many things that were left behind by non-tribal members who came into our community, who claimed to be environmentalists and said they were here to uplift Indigenous voices. I was left with 200 people's trash left in a waterway, a swamp essentially. And, it wasn't just their garbage that they left behind. They left behind people. And it was to the point where the only opportunity we had to make money was to follow protest to protest to protest. That's a quick and easy way to end up on some sort of government watch list. That's a quick and easy way to end up a felon, or, there's no safety in that. And it's kind of expected of you, is like, well, you're a warrior. You need to be front and center at every call. And it's like, what about my children? And I really felt like my cries were falling upon the ears of people who have these agendas to just watch cities burn. And, after joining the trades, I went from someone who would see high vis and panic. I couldn't tell you a Teamster from a laborer, everyone was a pipeliner. Everyone was a pipeliner and everyone was a threat. I fought Line 3 because as a mother, I was terrified for the future of my children. I was terrified by scare tactics on statistics that me and my children faced as Indigenous people, that my 3 daughters were at risk. I was taught 1 in 3 growing up. And then you have women in positions of leadership in these movements who will turn to you and tell you, those men over there, that's the boogeyman. Those are the men who want your children. And you believe it because you don't mistrust these women. You believe in everything they're telling you. And you get all these out-of-state workers coming in to work these pipeline projects. And what I've seen with the projects happening here, they were Native subcontractors. Many of them were women. Many of them were people I knew. And there's no one here on my res more passionate about the removal of these pipelines. It made sense for me to be a part of the project so I could get in there and come to a conclusion of my own about Enbridge. On top of being able to think for myself, I wanted an opportunity to really see what the world is like out there. I was angry, I was scared, and I was locked in on this narrow mindset and viewpoint. And being able to see from someone else's perspective has been completely life-changing. My children and I, we don't have to beg on social media anymore for pity or money so I can feed them something. I have an opportunity here to become a part of something bigger than myself. And that's what I was doing when I was fighting Line 3, was I wanted to be a part of something bigger than myself. I wanted to save the world. And, sometimes you don't have to save the entire world. Sometimes just being there for your children, being able to be home every night, being able to afford to put something warm in their stomach, that's changing the world. You know, like as a mother, there's nothing more important to me than raising the next generation. And I don't want to raise them to have so much hate and anger in their hearts. I am still processing all of it, because the Line 3 fight wasn't just a struggle. It was who I was. Protest defined me. I was addicted to the high of it. There's an adrenaline rush you get that can't be matched anywhere else. Like, I've never done drugs, but I would assume that is how people become addicted. It was such a rush to be there and to really feel like in this moment it's all on me. There's like a sense of importance you have. There's a sense of duty. I truly believe to the core of my being that if I were to die out there and be buried beneath that pipeline, Enbridge would never work again. I was willing to die for this, and to come to the realization that I was molded by the hands of people with an agenda to do what I did left me feeling used. It made me scared for the future of other Indigenous youth out there who are seeking a purpose, who want to be part of something bigger than themselves. Because everyone wants to be a hero, you know? Like, we grew up on movies like Avatar. We grew up on watching movies like The Hunger Games, and I was Katniss Everdeen. Like, it was really something to finally be someone, to feel like I had worth. And that's not something I really felt before. And it was something that I felt had to be given to me by other people. And it wasn't really clicking with me that that's on me to value myself and find my worth. It was devastating for me when Line 93 went online. When they finished that project, I felt numb. I dissociated for quite a while because what was the point? You know, like, there were so many questions I had that no one had the answers for. And it was just like traumatizing to realize that I put myself in position where I could have lost my kids. I could have lost my home. I could have died out there. None of us knew how close to death we really were. Like, I remember trying to enter the trades after and really struggling to find anywhere willing to hire me because I made a name for myself. You know, laborers didn't want to work with me. Teamsters didn't want to work with me. 49ers absolutely wanted nothing to do with me. I'd been locking to their excavators. Like, no, we don't want to work with this person. And it was, you know, I finally got hired by a tribal-owned company, a family-owned business that subcontracts for Enbridge. And I've never felt more safe in a work environment than I do out there on the line. It's wild to me that, you know, everything I believed myself to be, there was a job for me in the trades where I fit perfectly. And that was never an idea before in my head, you know, like that was wild. That was crazy to me. Why would I want to do that? And it's still, my head is still spinning from who I was and what I was doing to where I am now. And I'm only hoping that the people who followed and believed in me before care enough to continue watching so that they can learn something too. What we were doing out there wasn't sustainable. And that was something we were fighting for, was sustainability. But when you follow protest to protest to protest, and you're getting worn out emotionally, mentally, the amount of drainage you feel after going through something like that, I feel like I buried a large part of myself beneath that pipeline at every fight. And when it came to the end of the fight, I didn't know who I was anymore because I let the fight become me. I went into the fight against Line 3 with blinders on. I was fearful for my children to experience the traumas that I did as an Indigenous woman. I was fearful of statistics that I had heard my entire life. And I was a mother bear protecting her den. And I was told that these pipeline workers wanted to harm my children. And when you grow up within Indigenous communities that are already navigating so much trauma and so much anger, it was a climactic release to finally have someone to be angry at for all of it. Enbridge didn't put my grandmother in the boarding school. It wasn't Enbridge that harmed me as a child. But I hated these men for everything that I have experienced. And that wasn't fair to them. And it wasn't fair to put that on a child, to inherit someone else's enemies and agenda. And that's what's being done in these movements, is you have young and vulnerable people who have so much emotion and so much charisma and so much to offer the world. And you're putting them inside of trenches and you're locking them to excavators and they're throwing away their futures for it. Because essentially we don't know any better. And I think for me, it was all about finally being heard. Finally, someone is listening. Somebody sees me. And that was powerful. That called to other people who felt that way. And the thing about radicals is they begin to think for themselves. And people don't like that when you're taught to question all authority. And now they're questioning you. And you don't have any answers. Because that was one of the things, was like, what next? When we stop all these pipelines, what's next? Like, we can't just greenwash the world and everything goes to batteries, because that's also harming Indigenous areas, is like the lithium farming. But we didn't know that. We were told to focus on pipelines and stopping them. You know, we can't move forward without those answers. And I think that what Enbridge is doing and taking steps moving forward by creating relationships with Indigenous communities and sitting down at the table and holding conversations of like, where and how can we be better? That's a form of accountability I haven't seen in our movements, you know? Because if you ask a question in a movement like, why are you doing that? It's, how dare you question me? But like, if you get upset because something's happened on one of the projects, where and how can we be better? And I think that was something that really spoke to me, was the accountability. And, you know, they say it in their videos and stuff as integrity. And I was like, you know, why do you have to do integrity digs if these pipelines have integrity? Like, why do you have to keep checking? And I think Enbridge showed their integrity by being willing to hire someone like me and allowing me access into areas of this project that I would have never been able to, like, as a protester. The other day, I gathered sage from the right-of-way before it was damaged or harmed. And, like, to be there doing that without hearing a dispersal order by law enforcement was pretty wild to me. Like, it's been an amount of growth that this company has offered not only myself, but my family. You know, like the economic stability of having an income and not having to beg on social media for someone wealthy to kick down some funds so I can feed my kids is a big deal to me. My goal was to stop Line 3 by any means necessary. And I was a terror to a lot of the people who worked these projects. I'm sure many of them have PTSD and are in therapy just from coming in contact with me. I was ruthless. I was nonviolent, sure, but I was never peaceful. You know, if you met me on the easement, it's not something you would forget. And that's not who I am. That was, it isn't and it is. You know, like we all have so much that make us who we are, and fighting Line 3 is a huge part of that. I was a protester. I wasn't just a protester, I was the protester. And that's why it made sense to join these projects, because Enbridge talks about integrity. And I was willing to ask them to prove that. Hire me. Let me in. Let me take a look at what you've got going on here. Give me a chance to see for myself and come to my own conclusions, because I never did before. I took what I was told and I ran with it. And I've learned a lot from people who support these. Oh man, our light. I learned a lot from people who support the projects. I've learned a lot from people who didn't. And the craziest part was the amount of effort it took to join the trades. I have been invited to Line 5 specifically by people who are from Bad River, and I was asked to fight Bad River strong. We were promised the powwow grounds. We were told that this would be acceptable, and I want Bad River to know that even though we were nonviolent, we weren't peaceful. And you can't control the actions of people who are fueled by so much emotion. And I know that Bad River has had experience with this, you know, with the boat landings and other environmentalist groups, but the way that people enter your community under the guise of uplifting Indigenous voices is parasitic. It starts before the project even arrives. It starts before Enbridge themselves decide, oh, okay, we're going to fix this or do an integrity dig here. There are people looking at your community as the next Standing Rock, and they want to make a profit on it. And that scares me, because with a pipeline project, when you get hired onto a project, you have to give your name, all your information, and they're able to do like a background check. For a protest, there's no etiquette. There's nothing there to prevent someone from 6 states away showing up in your backyard who may or may have not hurt a child. Those things that we feared about pipeliners and MMIW exist within these protest movements as well. And that was one of the pivotal points for me, was the hypocrisy of the movement, is we demanded that pipeline workers take specific classes and training regarding sex trafficking, violence, tribal awareness. These people coming to uplift Indigenous voices, they have no tribal awareness a lot of them believe they have an Indian name from Standing Rock fight. A lot of them come in with names that aren't really theirs, hiding who they really are, and there's no way to prove whether or not these people are safe. And as much as you want to weed out the bad ones, when you have an influx of people not from here coming into your community, there exists a level of threat. And that reigns true whether it be construction workers or protesters. But the thing about protesters is if they come in and they feel invited to be there and their friends are coming too, at the end of the day, you never know how many or may not show up. You can't prevent property destruction, theft. There's so much range that could happen overnight, from civil unrest to full-on bomb threats. I had elders here on my reservation who were evicted in negative below weather because of a bomb threat. That wasn't something that we approved of or wanted or even knew was going to happen. But these are the things that happen when people who don't have the best of intentions for your community show up overnight with the feeling that they are here to save you. It's a savior complex that many of these people carry. And at the end of the day, if they can pat themselves on the back because they helped a poor, broke Indian, they don't care who they've harmed in the process.